And for an expert's take, we are joined by Professor Robert E. Kelly, Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Pusan National University. Dr. Kelly, what's your take on the latest missile launch by North Korea? Is this any different from the previous launches?
Well, we're not entirely sure if they're really missile launches at all. I have the feeling this might actually be artillery shelling or testing. It's almost certainly a response to what has happened recently. I think your reporters were correct. I think that's the general consensus now. We're still waiting to hear from the South Korean Ministry of Defense what exactly happened. There'll be some effort probably to try to find debris if it washes further out. But it's almost certainly a response, right? The North Koreans have sort of done this in the past when they get sort of hit by resolutions and sanctions and things like this. They almost always respond in some way. I'm actually rather surprised it's this tame. I would have expected that the North would have actually responded much more sharply, given that these sanctions are actually quite biting.
Right. Well, Professor Kelly, the Council has sought to hobble North Korea's nuclear weapons program before, but the country has repeatedly flouted those measures. Now, do you think the new sanctions, the toughest sanctions that you mentioned, will work, and why not?
I'm actually reasonably confident that these sanctions, well, I think they're a good step. I'm hopeful, I guess, I'm reasonably confident they will work. That is to say that these sanctions begin to target third parties and North Korea's financial transactions. Now, a lot of the sanctions in the past targeted North Korea itself, but of course, as we all know, the North Koreans don't import or export a great deal, so going after North Korean trade and things like that doesn't really do much damage to the regime. They also do a great deal of illicit stuff, which by definition runs around sanctions, things like counterfeiting and drug running. So it's been hard to actually use traditional sanctions against North Korea. So what these do now is they expand this to companies and countries that interact with North Korea, sort of like banks in the Middle East, for example, or banks in China, right? Countries in Africa and the Middle East that have often traded with North Korea and gone around the sanctions. This is an effort to sort of go after those countries, third-party sanctions. That will be controversial, but it should hurt. So yes, I'm somewhat confident.
Well, Professor, given the North's legacy of provocation, is all hope lost in sitting Pyongyang down and knocking out a nuclear deal, similar to the one struck between world powers and Iran?
I'm highly skeptical that the North Koreans will actually deal. The North Koreans spent an enormous amount of their very small resources to develop nuclear weapons and missile technology. I've heard estimates that the program has cost North Korea more than 5% of its GDP. This is in a country where something like 20 to 25% of its people are on the verge of starvation or malnutrition on a regular basis. So this was a huge, huge effort by North Korea. The only way they would give it up is if they were offered something really dramatic, and I just don't see that in the cards. The North Koreans have just not expressed interest in dealing with this. We know that the Obama administration actually approached the North Koreans sort of tacitly on the side late last year before the test in January and asked them if they wanted to come to a deal and talk about it, denuclearization, and they said no and went ahead with the test. So I'm quite skeptical.
So, we've seen this situation play out time and time again, Professor Kelly. Is there really no way for any of the world powers to strike a balance with Pyongyang? I know you just said that they don't deal, but can there be hope that perhaps something could be struck?
Sure. I hate to sort of say the same thing all over again because the Chinese are getting sick of us Westerners saying this to them. But the Chinese, I think, are the ones who have the key over North Korea, right? The Chinese say all the time that they don't, but I just don't believe that, and I don't think many Western analysts do either. North Korea is very, very dependent on Chinese trade, Chinese diplomatic protection at the United Nations, access to the global financial institutions through Chinese banks, right? All the illicit trade that comes into North Korea, all the yachts and the TVs and the top shelf liquor that the elite in Pyongyang enjoy, all that stuff comes through China, right? And the Chinese government may not want to admit it, but the rest of us know it. And so I do think that when it comes to the world powers, right, we need to narrow this discussion to China. I do not think that North Korea will deal with the UN. They threatened to walk out of the UN human rights body just this morning. I doubt that will work. There won't be a sort of deal like there was with Iran. But if we can get to China, and I think that is happening slowly because the Chinese voted for the sanctions today, then maybe there will be progress. But China is the key.
All right, perhaps there is hope yet. Anyway, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us, Dr. Kelly.